Chapter 15: Beauty and Conversion. The idea of conversion and the idea of beauty seem to exist on different levels of moral seriousness, at least in the minds of some. To those people, the experience of the beautiful seems too subjective or too dangerous to carry redemptive significance. Catholic intellectuals of the first rank, such as Father William F. Lynch, Jacques Maritain, Hans Urs von Balthasar, have labored to keep beauty from being dismissed by successive generations of the Catholic faithful. Like our evangelical brethren, devoted Catholics are continually tempted toward an abstract rationalism, stripped of aesthetic interest, in defense of a much battered faith. Rationalism treats truth without concern for either the role of sense, the senses, or the necessity of personal appropriation. Rationalism denotes an approach to truth that recognizes only mental activity as a way of receiving and affirming the truths of human existence. Rationalism, in short, forgets the body. It asserts the primacy of self-conscious inference over the spontaneous, intuitive reception of luminous presence. It recognizes argument and ignores vision. To be sure, there are good reasons for rationalism. Intuitive vision and aesthetic experience in general do not stand the test of public verification in any scientific sense. This does not mean, however, that they cannot be part of a philosophical or theological understanding of how persons convert to new and different understandings of life and its proper end. But rationalism would, if it could, limit philosophical and theological discourse solely to that which is verifiable. The genius of the philosopher Maritain and theologians von Balthasar and William F. Lynch is that they hung on tightly to human experience. As Maritain once remarked, Thomists need, quote, soft bodies in order to be receptive to the experience that speaks of God. They clung to what subjects experience in their lifelong journey toward God. Human persons don't just live in bodies, they are bodies. What does this obvious fact imply? It implies the centrality and the unavoidability of the aesthetic, derived from the Greek word aesthesis, meaning sense experience. But once again, we confront a pervasive problem of expectations. To speak of aesthetics, for most people, is to address matters of so-called high culture. This is a fundamental error. The aesthetic, in its foundational sense, is the doorway to all knowledge, that is, through the senses, and the acquisition of all value. The reason why a convert need not be ashamed of touting beauty as his entryway into the faith is because we all must begin with the body. Indeed, I am surprised by conversion stories that consist only of intellectual arguments and closely rendered interpretations of various texts, whether scriptural or theological. It is my understanding of human love that a person requires some stimulus exciting the will to act. Something must initially be seen, heard, felt, in order for such intellectual exercises even to begin. What causes desire, what motivates the will, is the sight, so to speak, of something beautiful or something good. This is the classic relationship between the will and the intellect. The will being the running power, and the intellect being the catching power. Since we are not angels and do not receive the direct illumination from God of nature, we would be completely cut off from the world and ourselves without the senses. We would never love, much less think. Hans Urs von Balthasar said in his first volume of The Glory of the Lord that, quote, whoever sneers at her name, that is, beauty's name, as if she were the ornament of a bourgeois past, whether he admits it or not, can no longer pray, and soon will no longer be able to love. It was certainly true in my own case that these many encounters led to my ultimate conversion. All the hundreds of books that I read, the hours of music that I heard, conversations, the arguments, the disputes, the friends lost and gained, the years of uncertainty and doubt, all were grounded in moments of inarticulate vision. In the experience of beauty, there are three elements present. Most casual conversations about beauty fail to distinguish between them, and confusion usually results. First, there is the object itself. Then there's the subject, that is, or the viewer, you, who sensually perceives beauty. And finally, there is the relationship that is created between you, the subject, and the object of beauty. The subject of aesthetic experience can be further subdivided into those who create objects of art and those who experience them. Most of what I can say about beauty in my conversion is confined to my experience of it, but I don't believe that this relegates me to a pure subjectivism. In the experience of beauty, we are responding to the perception of form in objects or in actions. That form is attractive to the human mind because it displays order and clarity in the midst of complexity. In beauty, the mind glimpses the handiwork of mind, capital M, or as Dorothy Sayers would put it, we observe the mind of the maker. The ecstatic experience that is at the heart of seeing the beautiful, that delicious moment of going outside oneself, is a response to the ecstasy of creation, whether creation by a human or a divine artist. The creator moves outside himself by making an object which conforms to an inner vision or intuition. Thus, beauty is made possible by intelligence, both in the person who sees it and the artist who makes what we delight in. It is often said in the tradition of St. Thomas and the Neoplatonists that beauty is one of the transcendental attributes of being itself. Beauty as a transcendental is never perceived directly any more than any other transcendental can be known immediately. However, the experience of finite beauty is undoubtedly grounded in that transcendent beauty that belongs to all beings. Transcendent beauty, like transcendent goodness, persists regardless of the destructive forces of ugliness or evil. Just as Satan himself retains the goodness of his being, as St. Thomas teaches, he also retains the beauty of his existence. To be trumps not to be. This explains why beauty has the power to convert. To say this may belabor the obvious to most people. We all know that beauty is used to sell any and all products. We all know that personal beauty is one of the greatest advantages in life, in spite of its apparent disadvantages. We all know that beauty gets our attention, keeps it, and lifts our spirits and distracts us from the boredom of everyday life. So to ask why beauty converts is to raise a question that really lies at the heart of our everyday experience. We can all agree that beauty attracts our attention because beauty, by definition, is that which delights the senses. This, in fact, is the classic definition of beauty given by St. Thomas. Being delightful, beauty immediately becomes the object of our appetite and our will. That is, beauty appears to us as desirable under the form of the good. Herein, of course, lies the danger of beauty. Its experience leads us out toward the possibility of embracing some new, perhaps destructive, object of love. Let it be said quite clearly that not all conversions are for the good. that beauty does not necessarily serve the angels. The moral meaning of beauty is intrinsically ambiguous, which is to say, beauty can lead us to heaven or to hell. I think that despite this ambiguity, there is a strong impulse within the experience of beauty itself that is in line with Plato's teaching in the Symposium. Any experience of beauty opens a wound that can be healed only by contact with a greater beauty, a greater good. In other words, aesthetic experience can be, from a moral perspective, self-correcting. This is not an argument I am prepared to develop or even defend at length here. But I do think that the understanding of beauty as proposed by Aquinas and later Thomas puts the person who develops a genuine critical appreciation for the beautiful at an advantage in the search for ultimate reality. When Satan uses beauty to seduce us away from God, he is using that which belongs to God in the first place. He is disordering that which is fundamentally ordered by the Creator and to the Creator. To summarize, beauty converts us because it attracts us. It elicits our desire. And it makes us yearn for unity with beauty itself. Beauty converts us because in unifying ourselves with it, we become new. This is why we must always take care in what we choose to love. Or perhaps better to say that we are moved to love, because what we love will change us over time. Given my perspective, you will understand if I say bad taste is no little matter. Bad taste leads to a union through affectivity, through our emotions, with things that can diminish us. Bad taste, in fact, is a habit of clinging to what may defile, demean, and diminish us. Our entertainments, in short, are not trivial pursuits. In telling this story of beauty and conversion, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I, D.L. Hudson, convert to the Catholic faith, once 20 years ago underwent a series of extraordinary experiences that led me to convert. I would rather leave you with the impression that I have been blessed with a constant experience of conversion, one that began in a dramatic way, worthy perhaps of public telling. But if any of us, whether converts or not, ever stop converting, then we have all fallen short of the vision we originally received. Chapter 16. Beauty Will Save the World. One of the central characters in Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, says, "Beauty will save the world." And that was clever of Dostoevsky. By saying it through one of his characters, he doesn't have to defend it. I'm going out on a limb to say precisely that. Beauty will save the world, and I will have to defend it against those who find such a proposition objectionable. But how do you defend it when it is not, strictly speaking, demonstrable? I must admit that my certainty in this matter is grounded in experience, my own, and that of many others who have found the lure of beauty irresistible. Thus, the defense of beauty does not consist of an aesthetic. It requires telling stories, one after another, of beauty's saving effect. To this, the skeptic will declare, "You believe that beauty will save the world because you were saved by beauty." Of course, what I believe about my own experience does not prove anything in itself. And to make matters worse, even though it's my experience, I cannot be sure in telling my story that I am telling the entire truth. We have no privileged access to knowing ourselves. The soul, as Aquinas says, cannot look at itself. What may make my story convincing to others is that others may recognize themselves in it, or they may recognize something they aspire to. The story may help in the daunting task of self-knowledge. I have found that the lure of beauty, so to speak, has been the pivot point for many conversion stories of all kinds across the ages. So what I offer here is neither a metaphysics of beauty nor a theological aesthetics. This is a story of my unexpected and unsought encounters with beautiful things that ultimately led me beyond them. The lure of beauty has been recognized in the tradition of Christianity again and again. For me, it was Jacques Maritain who first opened my eyes to it, but it is the comprehensive work of the late Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose majestic The Glory of the Lord has made theological reflection on aesthetics finally acceptable. But these exercises, as the reader will see, are not uniform. They do not unfold systematically or even chronologically. My conversion cannot be summarized as a reading of texts or encounters with music and poetry. My life, I hope, doesn't consist of a series of reviews. In Plato's Symposium, Socrates presents the view that experience of finite beauty creates a continual hunger for infinite beauty. The beauty of the body leads to the beauty of the soul and onward to the beautiful itself. If conversions always resulted accordingly, one would be led, say, from Bach's B minor Mass toward God, who is praised in the composer's music. But the effect of beauty on the restless soul is often not that straightforward. For example, many will recall that beauty played an important role in Augustine's conversion. Augustine became conscience-stricken when he realized that his emotional reaction to suffering on a stage was greater than his response to the same suffering in real life. This led him to examine his dependence on sensual enjoyment and look within for the immaterial traces of God's presence. Whereas Augustine's soul was pricked by his emotional reaction to works of the imagination, as opposed to the world he lived in, mine was stirred by guilt about being drawn to the world of beauty at all, a world deeply distrusted in my evangelical surroundings. The religious leaders I knew would have regarded Dostoevsky's statement, "Beauty will save the world," as trite at best, and at worst superficial and morally irresponsible. These moralists regard beauty only as an occasion of sensual sin, a temptation to disregard the true things of the spirit. Part of the story I have to tell is how I overcame what I felt was a religious prohibition against beauty, a prohibition that I found antithetical to the full glory of God's grace. In this I was aided most of all by the Catholic novel. To the religious reader wary of the aesthetic, the novel has the advantage of being content-rich about human life. Reading a Catholic novel, you are reading about God and humankind, heaven and hell, sin and forgiveness. You can be assured that the act of reading is not a wasteful effort of a, quote, carnal mind. Chapter 17, Catholic Novels. Reading, said Saint Jose Maria Escrivá, has made many a saint. In my own case, it has merely made a convert, but I do continue to read ever more deeply into the mystery that is the Church. Thomas Merton started on his road to the Church with the accidental discovery of Etienne Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy in the Columbia University Library. We are foolish if we forget the power of the written word. As I moved toward the Church, my reading prodded me onward with a series of vaguely related insights. Although I understood only a little of the content of the Catholic faith, I knew that it explained the limitations of other Christian traditions, both the liberal Protestant and the Southern Baptist, in which I was raised. It would take me years to pass through my own period of protest and grasp the inner coherence of the Church itself. I was a young college professor then and still reeling from the effect of the Catholic bomb sent by Erasmo when I began to read Catholic novels one after the other. By the time I finished this assignment, luckily I had a wise and tasteful tutor, I would not have dreamed of turning back. There are, in fact, Catholic novels, though certain learned people dispute the fact. I have no comprehensive definition of the Catholic novel, neither would I ever attempt one. However, I happily name a novel as Catholic when it presents to the reader a narrative that embodies some substantial aspect of the Catholic faith. In other words, a Catholic novel is one that ably suggests to its readers moments of insight, where we catch a glimpse of God's providence, as, for example, in The Diary of a Country Priest by the French writer Georges Bernanos. In these kind of novels, readers can become pilgrims. It is said that people don't read much anymore, that we live in a multimedia age, and that the act of reading is on the wane. I don't take these prognostications seriously. Nothing is likely to replace reading as the most intimate medium of enjoyment and self-examination. Certainly not the internet or the iPhone. When we want to change a person's life, we still give that person a book, and we wait, hoping. As you've seen, I had been raised in a Protestant home and had become an ardent Southern Baptist in college before attending Princeton Theological Seminary. There I read the greats, Luther, Calvin, Barth, Tillich, and the Niebers. I began to realize that the first principle of Protestantism, ridding the faith of idolatry, had gone so far as to undermine Christian intelligence. My Catholic bomb was packed with many spiritual and theological books from the great Dominican Garrigou-Lagrange and Maisie Ward on G.K. Chesterton, to the simple verse of St. Francis of Assisi. With every book, a strong impression received years earlier when I had read St. Augustine's On the Trinity was confirmed. Catholic Christianity embodied the fullness of God's revelation without the narrowing refractions of other, younger Christian communions. The first principle of Catholicism was indeed the Incarnation, and that centrality shone through all my reading. Thus, if there is a litmus test for the Catholic novel, it must be whether the novel is capable of conspiring in spiritual conversion. Even if one bears in mind that conversion is ongoing, not at all confined to a Damascus Road experience, this test flies in the face of most aesthetic niceties about the freedom of the writer, the novel, and the audience. It goes without saying that authors who consciously intend to convert their readers probably will end up doing a poor job. That's the trouble with avid readers like myself. Giving into speculations, we risk encouraging the worst habits of young novelists. Among the novels that led me to the church, I want to recommend the following. First, Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. If there's another novel that wears its moral consciousness as lightly as Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, I don't know it. Perhaps that is why it works so well. Like Charles Ryder, himself the main character, the reader is slowly and slyly seduced into the Catholic undercurrents of the aristocratic Marchmain family. The long final coda of Lord Marchmain's death, his sign of the cross, and the repentant confession of Julia on the staircase distill the choice we all must finally make for or against God. As Julia puts it in refusing to leave her husband for Charles, "But I saw today there was one thing unforgivable, the bad thing I was on the point of doing, that I'm not quite bad enough to do, to set up a rival good to God's." The second novel I would recommend is by a French Catholic writer named Julian Green. The novel is entitled The Other One. Julian Green was born of a Protestant mother from Savannah, Georgia, and a French Catholic father. His novels have always riveted my attention. Although his novels like Moira and Each in His Own Darkness are better known, it was the obscure The Other One that left its deepest mark on me. This novel, more than any other I knew, depicts the hunger for God as the source of all human appetites. I would later recognize this unquenchable desire with its rich moral implications in Aquinas' Anthropology, but I first met it in Julian Green. Set in Copenhagen, the story follows a recently converted man who returns to a woman he has mistreated some years earlier, only to find the results of his immorality much worse than he expected. His penitential witness brings about a disturbing but absolutely convincing redemption. Few books have captured the painful death of spiritual rebirth in both characters as powerful as Julian Green's The Other One. Another novel that I would recommend, a novel that is my favorite Catholic novel, is Kristin Lavransdatter by the Norwegian writer Sigrid Undset. I'm not sure if there is a greater Catholic novel than this one. If there is, it's probably her other medieval epic, The Master of Hesviken. But I still prefer the more accessible and intimate Kristin. The first time I read Undset's trilogy, because Kristin is a trilogy, I was blessed with a very bad case of the flu, which kept me in bed for the entire read. My bouts with fever only intensified my connection with the unforgettable characters of the story. Just as movie buffs will argue the comparative merits of Scarlet Rhett Melody Ashley in Gone with the Wind, Undset fans delight in analyzing degrees of responsibility of the impetuous Kristin, her loyal father Lavrans, her warrior husband Erlend, and her jilted fiancé, the Foursquare Simon. No other novel that I know explores the biblical themes of the wages of sin and the sins of the father as accurately and charitably as Kristin Lavransdatter. Its impact on the reader, as witnessed in the novel's pivotal role in the life of Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic worker movement, can demonstrate a moral reorientation reminiscent of Dante's Purgatorio. I was able to pay a spiritual debt to Undset by editing a book entitled Sigrid Undset on Saints and Sinners, containing previously untranslated writing and critical essays. I've already mentioned the writer Walker Percy, but let me say another word about his novel Love in the Ruins. My reading into the church was not without its moments of laughter. The novel provided the perfect bridge from the existentialism of my graduate school days to the treasure of Catholic humanism. I thought it uncanny that Percy had placed his main character, Dr. Thomas More, in a Dantean landscape faced with Kierkegaardian choices that could be mediated only by the comic, sacramental resolution of a Catholic vision. It was as if Percy, and his other novels confirm this, had already experienced my philosophical and spiritual trials. He understood that demons inhabited the suburbs of my childhood, and not just the cities and the country. I have to mention the great novel Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor, one of her two novels, the other being The Violent Bear It Away. If you are familiar with the South, there's also plenty to laugh about in Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. John Huston's underrated film of the novel catches many of those moments perfectly, such as when Hazel Mote, the main character, tells his landlady he is a preacher of the Church Without Christ. She asks suspiciously, "Was that Protestant? Something foreign?" Indeed, O'Connor's novel is nothing less than a meditation on the loss of belief in Christ's active presence in the world through the church and its sacraments. Wise Blood made it clear to me why I was no longer content with the typical Protestant quarterly communion of grape juice done in memory of me. Finally, there is Under the Star of Satan by another French Catholic writer, George Bernanos. If O'Connor is one of those authors who puts you in the uncomfortable presence of the supernatural, George Bernanos is another. It's too bad that Diary of a Country Priest is his only novel that stays in print in English, because the others are just as powerful. Under the Star of Satan is primarily about the special vocation of the priesthood and its sacramental blessing on all of us. We follow the protagonist, the Abbé Donison, modeled on Jean-Marie Vianney, the Curé d'Ars, as he struggles for the souls of his parishioners, spending hour after hour in the confessional. We see his gift of unlocking the heaviest heart and the price he must pay for it. In the midst of his battle, we are also reminded not to take the metaphysical notion of evil as privation so literally as to discount its active presence in the world. A film has been made of this novel, but not as successfully as Huston's Wise Blood. On the other hand, Robert Bresson's film of Bernanos' The Diary of a Country Priest ranks as one of the most spiritually compelling films ever made. These are 6 of the novels that made me Catholic. There are many others from our rich cultural past I would recommend, especially homegrown Catholic writers like the other O'Connor, Edwin O'Connor, and J.F. Powers and John Hassler. The Canadian writer Morley Callahan, a friend and sparring partner of Ernest Hemingway, deserves a revival. The fiction of English writer Muriel Spark grows in stature as time passes. In fact, there has been a modest revival of good Catholic fiction. Alice Thomas Ellis, Torgny Lindgren, Ron Hansen, Piers Paul Reed, and Ralph McInerney are among the best. We can only pray that books such as theirs will be found upon the path of some pilgrim finding a way home. Chapter 18. Contrasting Aesthetics. At the time of my conversion, I was accused by various friends of converting for aesthetic reasons. Even if I harbored such motives, the more masses I went to, the more I realized they didn't measure up to the midnight masses televised from the Vatican. In fact, liturgical practice was so bad in my view, lousy music, weak homilies, half-hearted gestures. I came to see a definite irony in the experience of beauty that helped lure me into the Catholic Church, at least in the liturgies I was attending, with some exceptions. The masses seemed more dispirited than what I had expected. Yes, I first learned to love Catholicism from books, and would inevitably be disappointed by actual participation in the day-to-day life of the Church. Expectations raised by the glories of Dante, Aquinas, Newman, and Maritain are soon disappointed by contemporary parish architecture, sloppiness in liturgical execution, inattentive congregations, the lack of fellowship as compared to evangelicals, and most important, the increasing approximation of Protestant worship and piety in many Catholic parishes. In recent years, there have been various attempts to revitalize the sense of community in Catholic parishes. These programs sometimes turn the sanctuary into a fellowship hall in the manner of evangelicals, forgetting the reverence owed the presence, the real presence in the tabernacle, unless, of course, he has been placed elsewhere. Catholics must learn to meet and greet people naturally without imitating an evangelical style that does not integrate into the Catholic liturgy. Evangelicals have been throwing parties in their churches for decades. Catholics don't have a clue how to do it and should stop trying. The older generation of Catholics were used to attending Mass quietly, without much participation. There were other opportunities in these older, more tightly knit communities to create and enjoy friendships, such as the parish school. Where these institutions no longer exist, the younger generations are understandably finding it difficult to engender the warmth of fellowship that they can find at the Baptist church across the street. These concerns bother me less now, since they betray a Protestant penchant for making the reality of worship and church life in general dependent on the enthusiasm and skillful execution of the preacher and the congregation. If I understand the meaning of the Mass, its reality is in no way dependent upon the skill or charisma of the celebrant, although it may benefit from both in its aesthetic power to claim our attention. Perhaps I was having trouble getting used to the repetition of the Catholic Mass. It is basically the same from week to week during ordinary time. Kierkegaard, the Protestant theologian after all, had warned me against the impossibility of aesthetic repetition, meaning that repetition of the same experience rarely produces the pleasure it induces the first time. Baptist and all evangelically tinged Protestant churches avoid the problem of aesthetic repetition with the personality and charisma of the minister. A powerful homily always leads to Sunday afternoon dinner conversation devoted to evaluating the performance of the pastor, the success of worship depending upon his eloquence. Protestant pastor bears a heavy burden to be original, creative, and innovative. The Catholic priest depends only on the sacramental nature of the Eucharistic act. He does not have to stage to compete with MTV the way megachurches now have with projection screens, lights, and high-power audio. The priest simply repeats the ancient words. Protestant worship seems to be much more preoccupied with the aesthetics of personalities and charisms, while the Mass, although enjoying aesthetic form, remains exactly the same regardless of time, place, or person. Thus, the reality of Jesus Christ remains the same, all of us at all times, regardless of our transient feelings or our capacity for attention at that given moment. Protestant worship, with its entire focus on the preaching of the Word, unwittingly promotes the cult of the pastor's personality or his brilliance, which explains why Protestant churches rise and fall with the coming and going of the minister. What a burden for the Protestant pastor to bear, without the objectivity of the Eucharistic act to celebrate. This probably explains why their sermons are so articulate. They have to be. Of course, these criticisms of Protestant worship are aimed at the deeper level of the articulated and unarticulated Baptist credo, the Protestant suspicion of embodiment, especially into space, of the holy, and its all too pessimistic fear of beauty and of idols. For Protestants, the word in time is trusted, the spoken word, as if it were more living for its momentary duration, like the passing sound of the wind, like the Holy Spirit. This orientation toward inspired and charismatic personality is synonymous with the direction of modern life and the influence of the media in our standards of judgment. Often the Catholic Church and its worship will seem medieval or uninteresting by comparison. For me, it has taken some getting used to. There are times I miss the full-throated hymn singing of a Baptist congregation, especially on Easter morning. My wife had to grab my sleeve once in a suburban New York parish on Easter when I was so upset that no one was singing Jesus Christ is risen today that I was going to walk into the aisle and say so. I'm glad I didn't. The Mass is a ritual and time of sanity and calm, where no one should expect to be entertained, and no one should mistake the adrenaline of religious enthusiasm for creedal certainty. The worst thing the Catholic Church could do is to give the Mass away to those who want to jazz it up by stealing our silence. At least a lackluster liturgy keeps us from the heresy of emotivism, that is, identifying our feeling states with our beliefs. It is the liturgical celebration of the Eucharist that ensures avoidance of aesthetic dialectics, that is, making things interesting or relevant. Catholic liturgy resists the encroachment of enthusiasms and charisms that come and go, claiming to make everything alive, real, authentic, and true again. The Mass is freedom from the cult of feeling, the equation of truth with the intensity of sensation or heightened self-awareness. The same problems that I find at the heart of Protestant worship, I also find in its theology, piety, and ecclesiology. Each of the problems is, in the same way, associated with a resurgent subjectivity, a misplaced trust in the inspired individual, whether pastor or layman. Theologically, this is seen in the Protestant, quote, priesthood of the believer, with its implicit promotion of anyone's inspired relationship to the Bible. In this piety and spiritual formation, one finds inspired individuals who are free to proclaim that God told them to do such and such, and no one has the authority to say otherwise and deny it. The effect of this constant underground of enthusiasm, as the Catholic historian Friedrich Herr calls it in his unparalleled intellectual history of Europe, plays havoc in the life of the Church, eventually emerging as the Protestant movement led by the monk Martin Luther. The lack of theological authority, other than personal readings of the Scriptures, naturally leads to myriad interpretations, each spawning its own church, which is inevitably doomed by its own substructure to spawn a few more. Of course, the typical response to all this is a series of questions concerning the nature and legitimacy of the Catholic hierarchical authority. The major flaw in these questions is that they fail from the beginning to see these institutions as gifts to us, gifts that we need for life on earth, for spiritual growth. Instead, they are seen as unnecessary impediments to our freedom, as if mere potentiality were valuable in itself. And even worse, it is as if the very means afforded to us by God for our peace and joy were being rejected so that we can do it for ourselves and be more authentic and less childish. I am speaking here of the authority of the sacraments, the priest, and the power of the magisterium and the Holy Father. Occam's razor does not apply to things of the Spirit that have come as gifts, not as logical necessities. Nonetheless, even these things of the Spirit are ratified by common sense. One can see this especially concerning the sacrament of confession. How many therapists would be put out of business if we Catholics took advantage of this great opportunity? The priests, the confessional, the Eucharist, Holy Father himself, are all gifts to us in the same way that prayer is. And indeed, the same argument is made against prayer in favor of meditation, the latter being a way of getting in touch with yourself without having to look toward some transcendent being when it is actually your own being you're concerned about. The principle of the incarnation is at stake in all this, whether we believe that God has become flesh to be among us. Protestants allow God his historical presence in his church, his body, a concept that has more than biblical warrant to satisfy the most ardent skeptic. The church is the body of Christ. This perhaps sums up what I have found in Catholicism, but I do not find in Protestantism. The Protestant insistence on inspired enthusiasm and charism rather than on revealed deposited doctrine on scriptures apart from their interpretation by the church in history denies the actual real presence of Christ in the church. Chapter 19, Julian Green. Julian Green is well known in France, but familiar to very few in the United States. Green was born in 1900 to an American mother from Savannah, Mary Hartridge Green, and a French father. His bond with his Southern Calvinist mother, whose father was a Confederate officer, was extremely close, though she died when he was only 14. In spite of becoming perhaps the most cosmopolitan writer in a cosmopolitan city, Paris, he kept a large Confederate flag on the wall of his apartment on the Rue de Vanneau. He once described himself as a Southerner lost in Europe, regardless of what I do. Green published 18 novels before he died in 1998. His many volumes of journals made his private life one of the most public in France and constitute a cultural history of 20th century Paris, with the exception of his sojourn at the University of Virginia from 1919 to 1922 in the war years, 1940 to 45, which he spent in Washington, D.C. In 1971, he became the first writer with American citizenship to be admitted to the Académie Française, taking the place of the Catholic writer François Mauriac, whom Green eulogized upon his entry. Green converted to Catholicism soon after the death of his mother, but over the course of his long life, his chosen faith would constantly be struggling against his own sexual tendencies toward other men. He was outside the church for 20 years, 1919 to 1939, and though he never lost faith, he could not pray. Of all the novelists I read on my way into the church, none touched me more deeply than Julian Green. I am ashamed to admit that I had to rely on translations of his, I am told, very beautiful French. But thanks to artful translators, including his sister Anne, I was introduced to a fictional landscape of faith and sexuality that allowed me for the first time to comprehend erotic desire in the context of divine creation. A passage from his diary reads, "What I have against a life of pleasure is that it kills in a man all aptitude for love. It gives him the heart of a eunuch." I said this to someone who was piqued by my remarks, but I feel strongly that I am right. Green continues, "Nothing is colder than a pleasure-loving man. This is perceptible only in the long run, because during youth there exists the external misunderstanding about desire and love, which are taken one for the other. Love is not necessarily linked to desire. It surpasses it continually, but love is not to be met every day. It does not run about the streets. In fact, that is precisely what it never does." March 3rd, 1955. Love surpasses desire because, as Green helped to show me, all love is finally directed at God. Most of his novels reflect this struggle between sexual desire and the desire for God, a battle that often leads his characters toward violence or even suicide. The source of Green's concern for this subject is surely his mother's Puritanism, which was so graphically described in his journals and memoirs about his youth. Though it's easy to recognize the author's preoccupations in the actions of his characters, his novels are in no way written to express a Catholic message or to proselytize. Green, the Catholic writer, remains artfully hidden, and his characters, which Green once said he prayed for, are substantially drawn and memorable. I read all of his novels available in translation, including Moira, Each in His Own Darkness, The Transgressor. But it was and still the other one, as I mentioned earlier in this reading, that held the greatest meaning for me. Here Green treats the story of Roger, who returns to the scene of his seduction of a young woman named Karen to seek her forgiveness. But finding that her life has been filled with a series of degradations, including a loss of faith, During the German occupation of Denmark, Roger feels responsible for Karen's ruin. Green's narration looks at the seduction and its aftermath from differing points of view of the seducer and the seduced. The seduction itself is told by Roger, while Karen relates Roger's return 10 years later to receive forgiveness. Roger's seduction of the innocent Karen is deliberately destructive not only of her virginity, but of her faith. Karen, who knows she is being used, is helpless to avoid him. What taints his seduction, however, is not the boredom that follows his sexual conquest, but his knowledge that she gave in to his aggression knowingly. Roger wanted his desire to overwhelm her, but Karen's choice to leave the church and sleep with Roger mitigates his satisfaction. Years later, when Roger returns to find the now ruined Karen, she muses on the difference between sexual desire in men and women. Green, as his character Karen, speak the following word. Deep down, my sensuality was no more than a thirst for affection. It was this that had been quenched in a physical frenzy. With that annihilating joy would I have folded my arms, which now held no one, round a being I could cherish. There was something in me that refused to make of a man an instrument of sexual pleasure. My soul demanded much more than that. Surely every woman would understand me. It is our fault if their constant pangs of bodily hunger throw men into a state nearing madness, because it is with half-mad people that we have to deal. If they could only see themselves at certain moments. As for women, they never entirely lose their heads and can only observe the appalling misunderstanding when they see lust trying to pass itself off as love. And Karen continues in the novel. On this point, they cannot explain themselves since men use the same words as they do, but to indicate things of a different nature. Women love and men love, but only their bodies are united. There are sublime exceptions, I know, such are as treated in poetry. I am not denying that these unique moments occur. Speaking generally, for a man, variety is the rule, and the bed is the tomb of love, or rather of one love after another. With that self-sufficiency does the King of creation bestow a plural on this word where he himself is concerned, his precious loves, and the fact that he can't count them makes him think that he's a great lover, whereas in his headlong rush he misses out on love in the singular. Few writers treat the relation of sex to salvation and sanctity as deftly as Julian Green. Sexual yearning did not belong to the same netherworld of physical needs, but for the desire for God himself. Thus Green's fiction fleshes out the oft-quoted restless heart of St. Augustine. Some religious leaders would rather read about restless hearts in the abstract than be exposed to the sinners such as we meet in Green's fiction. These readers who tend to view all art through a moral prism before allowing themselves to enjoy it consider stories like that of Roger and Karen an occasion of sin rather than an occasion of spiritual insight. Their reticence puts them in a difficult situation regarding the Catholic novel, since so much important Catholic fiction revolves around adultery or seduction. It's true in Brideshead Revisited, Kristin Lavransdatter, Wise Blood, and Graham Greene's The End of an Affair, to name a few. Greene himself, with his own Puritan upbringing, was alive to this irony. He wrote in his journal, "Drag a writer away from his sin and he no longer writes." This, I admit, is a horrible statement to put into words. Is sin necessary to his work? Who would dare say such a thing? But remove sin and you remove the works. Are the works necessary? You might as well ask if a writer is necessary. He is inasmuch as God wishes him to exist. I can withdraw from the world, as I have so often been tempted to do, but then no more works. Now I believe that I came into this world to write books and to reach a few people. May 3rd, 1954. The greatest of Catholic poets, Dante, was also aware that his readers might raise the question, so he answered them at the beginning of his great Divine Comedy. Midway, the path of life that men pursue, I found me in a darkling wood astray, but the direct way had been lost to view. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say, what was this thorny wildwood intricate, whose memory renews the first dismay? Scarcely in death is bitterness more great, but as concerns the good discovered there, the other things I saw will I relate. These other things are what makes so many morally earnest religious readers cringe when reading fiction or viewing theater, film, painting, or sculpture. But it's clear from the history of Christian art that Green is absolutely correct. Avoid the sin, and you kill the creative imagination of the artist. The artist has been deprived of the material cause of his creation. The Catholic tradition, to its credit, has always recognized this, and thus many artists have found a home there. Puritanism in any guise, even when it quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, kills the imagination and strips truth of its sensuous splendor. Chapter 20, Meeting Maritain. By the time I discovered Jacques Maritain in 1980, his star had been in decline for a decade or more. The one-time leader of the French and American Catholic Renaissance was being accused of turning reactionary in his old age. His Peasant of the Garonne, with its criticism of Teilhard de Chardin, phenomenology, and Vatican II, made him a pariah among those luxuriating in the mood of change pervading the church and culture in the late 1960s. The occasion of my meeting with Maritain was the 1980 American Catholic Philosophical Association meeting in St. Louis. I had ventured there on a whim, thinking that with my newfound love of St. Thomas and all things Catholic, I would surely meet kindred spirits, and fortunately, I was correct. In the back pages of the program, I saw that an organization called the American Maritain Association was having a meeting on art and beauty, and that the featured speakers would be discussing his books Art and Scholasticism and Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. Warmly met by the association's treasurer and his wife, Judy and Tony Simone, and enthralled by a group of Catholic philosophers devoted to the subject of beauty, I was hooked instantly. For the next 14 years of my life, I sought to build and broaden the work of the American Maritain Association, not only for the sake of Maritain's message, but also for the lonely academics like myself, hungry for a community to support their work. I was intrigued by Maritain's notion of aesthetics, a conception that did not begin with theories of form or interpretation, but with the habits of the artists themselves. It's not that Maritain considered the contemplation of aesthetic form unimportant, that he thought it was putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. Since artworks arise from the creative intuition of artists, a philosophical understanding of art must focus on their habit of making things, of works of fine art, of the virtue called art. Maritain's inspiration for this kind of aesthetics went back to Aristotle and Plato through their medieval interpreters, particularly Aquinas. In addition, Maritain's circle of friendship included a who's who of prominent artists in France: Georges Rouault, Jean Cocteau, Maurice Sacks, Léon Bois, Arthur Laurier, Eric Satie, Julian Green, George Bernanos, André Gide, and Igor Stravinsky. His ability to befriend artists continued after he moved to America in the 1940s, as is typified by his relationship with and influence on Alan Tate, Caroline Gordon, Robert Lowell, Robert Fitzgerald, and John Howard Griffin, among others. By focusing on art as a habit of making, Maritain was able to address several of the central concerns that arise when religion and art come into contact. The most important of these questions of artistic freedom are two. How prominent a role should religious symbols play in the artwork? And should artworks always have an uplifting moral influence? Maritain surprised people with his answers, and still does. He defended the freedom of the artist from the overt use of religious references and from the demand of moralists to avoid depictions of sin. The habit of the fine artist, he argued, is ordered to the making of beautiful things. As such, its goal is beauty, not truth. To judge the quality of an artwork by the criterion used to judge, say, a theological essay, is to mistake what an artwork is for. Similarly, the moralist who judges a work by its morally offensive contents or lack of them is missing the point of art as well. It's no wonder Maritain shared such a deep friendship with the novelist Julian Green, who explored all the inner recesses of the sinful heart. Being familiar with the history of art, Maritain was able to illustrate from secular and religious art how the preponderance of theoretical concerns by an artist usually ended up ruining or at least weakening his art. This line of argument became the core of his 1952 Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., published as Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, a work which at once celebrated the spiritual significance of modern art, while showing that Surrealism, for example, was an example of modern art turning away from beauty in favor of inspired preaching. For me, Maritain's aesthetics came at just the right time. I was beginning my teaching career at Mercer University in Atlanta, and I was eager to treat literature, music, and the visual arts all together in my classroom. His distinction, drawing upon Aristotle, between the habits of art and prudence, prudence being moral judgment, allowed me to make an argument to my Southern Baptist students about why they were being asked to read novels such as Flaubert's Madame Bovary and Walker Percy's Love in the Ruins in my classroom at Mercer. Also, my encounter with Jacques Maritain, the man, came at just the right time. As a young man, he had been a student of biology and philosophy at the Sorbonne. His religious sensibilities were nil, nothing. He had been raised in a non-practicing family of liberal Protestants with socialist sympathies. But his penchant for philosophy got the better of him, and he began to discuss his doubts with a young Russian immigrant, also at the Sorbonne, Raisa Umansov. They each had deep anxiety, as only college students can, over the existence of an absolute upon which to base their beliefs and their lives. One day, walking through the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, they vowed that if within 1 year they had not discovered some absolute basis for life, they would commit suicide together. They were saved from that faith by the lectures of Henri Bergson, who showed them a way to affirm an absolute in a world of time and fluctuating appearances. A short time later, they would meet the spiritual writer Léon Bois and his family, whose piety and extreme, apparently chosen, poverty led them both into the church. What most admirers of Maritain don't remember is that Maritain started his career by breaking publicly with Henri Bergson over the nature of human intelligence, and particularly the ability of intellectual concepts to capture reality. Indeed, all of Maritain's early work, including his aesthetics, constitutes a retrieval of human intelligence, a retrieval of the possibility of knowing extramental reality through the immaterial action of the mind. Thus, when he noted the dangerous emphasis on phenomenology after the Vatican Council, his reaction, even as an older man, was not inconsistent with his as a younger man. All the major works of Maritain's first decade as an author take a combative pose against opponents of Thomistic realism. From his 1914 critique of Bergson's intuitionism to ardent scholasticism in 1920, which takes aims at the Renaissance selfhood and the decadence of so-called religious art, followed by Theonis in 1921, his general introduction to philosophy the next year, Anti-Modern, same year, St. Thomas Aquinas, Apostle of Modern Times in 1923, all culminating in the still controversial 1925 book, The Three Reformers. Although Maritain's rhetoric became less abrasive with age, many of his later works contained strongly worded polemics, namely his lectures on the philosophy of history and the philosophy of education, with their attacks on Hegel and Dewey. His books on anti-Semitism and the Nazi and communist threats, his response to Sartre, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard in Existence and the Existent, and the chapter on Kant in the lectures on moral philosophy given in 1951. No, the harsh words Maritain spoke toward his opponents were not at issue. Maritain never shrank from a fight. The issue, rather, was that these opponents were in fashion. Whereas Maritain as Democrat, as liberal, as humanist was acceptable, Maritain as Thomist was not. This attitude still pervades and persists in most Catholic institutions. Maritain's plight represents in miniature the tumult in Catholic intellectual life over the past 40 years. At some future date, Maritain and the legacy he represented will be vindicated. But at present, many Catholic intellectuals and pundits seek in vain to marry Catholicism with some form of postmodernism. Maritain's criticism struck too close to the bone for those Catholics involved in culture and politics. He had helped people to break loose, to claim their intellectual and political freedom, and now it seemed he was admonishing them to give it up. This symbol to the world's Catholic intellectuals, so designated by Paul VI at the end of the Vatican Council, was sounding as if he wanted to bring back the bygone days of the Middle Ages. But the truth is that Maritain, in The Peasant of the Garonne, points his finger at our consumption of intellectual fashion, quote, with all the glamour and happy arrogance of a reason maddened by frenzy for novelty. Indeed, what still seems to me one of the most powerful and prophetic aspects of his Peasant of the Garonne is its depiction of what he called logophobia, fear of the Logos. How much more we have learned about the hatred of the Logos, or reason, in the postmodern world of deconstruction and gender-race epistemologies since the heyday of mere existentialism as faced by Maritain. The question of restoring the ordinate relation of intelligence to being was always Maritain's major concern as a philosopher. Maritain defended the sense of objectivity at the heart of the Catholic tradition. Maritain sought to explain and defend a logocentric world where being is fundamentally intelligible. The same concern with restoring the intellect motivates his last critique of idealism, or the ideosophy, as he calls it in The Peasant of the Garonne. Ideosophers, according to Maritain, are not philosophers because by grasping first at the mind, they miss the true starting point for knowledge, which is the encounter of the mind with the reality external to it through the senses. Other of Maritain's mocking phrases, such as epistemological time worship or chronolatry, seem perfectly suited to the influences he was seeking to counteract in the wake of Vatican II. He predicted correctly the phrase Vatican II would be used to justify any and all demands for structural change in the Catholic Church. Those tempted to say he lacked historical mindedness should notice that Maritain starts from an historical analysis of modern Manichaeism in seeking to understand the mania in the 1960s for what he calls up-to-dateness. For 150 years, a pervasive Christian pessimism toward the world, he argued, not only subverted the church's understanding of its temporal mission, but also suppressed its appreciation of secular progress. What we are witnessing in the present age, he said, is the compensation for that suppression. He wrote, "Why be astonished that at the very announcement of a council, the enormous unconscious weight burst open in a kind of explosion that does no honor to human intelligence?" To his friends and admirers, it is clear that The Peasant of the Groan, published in 1966, cost Maritain a great deal, if not his earthly happiness, then without doubt much of his reputation. In the United States, anticipation of Maritain's book was so intense that translated excerpts of The Peasant were being circulated before the complete translation was available in 1968. Prior to its publication, Thomas Merton predicted the book would be dismissed without being read because of the negative hearsay from abroad. In fact, Merton proved to be at least partially right. The stateside critics, for the most part, panned The Peasant of the Groan. Robert Graham, writing in America, said that Maritain was being cast as a Brutus who stabbed a Giornamento in the back. The Peasant of the Groan, he agreed, had repudiated what its author had spent his whole life defending, and concluded that, quote, Maritain is now afraid the fire he helped to kindle is getting out of control. In France, where the controversy erupted, The Peasant of the Groan was the best-selling book of nonfiction in January of 1967. Within 4 months of its publication, 70,000 copies had been sold in 7 printings. Following the subsequent attacks, Maritain stood accused by both sides of turning against his friends, of treason, disloyalty, injustice, and of just having lived too long. Having returned to Europe from the United States in 1961, following the death of his wife, Raissa, Jacques Maritain, an acclaimed champion of democratic liberalism, international cooperation, human rights, social reform, an increased role for the laity in the church, and progressive movements in art and culture, died in 1973, branded a reactionary. In my view, Maritain lived long enough to see that his readers, like all readers, pick and choose. He saw that many of those who embraced his political views, particularly his pioneering work on human rights, didn't understand that without the Thomistic anthropology and epistemology, the whole project of grounding human rights in human nature came tumbling down. Without an immaterial soul, human beings don't deserve any greater respect than a horse or a cow. And without an immaterial intellect that grasps universal truths, we cannot claim to know any more than a horse or a cow about what is right or wrong. Anyone who wants to try to find a way out of the present postmodern maze needs only to consult the early Maritain who broke free from Henri Bergson, and the later Maritain who schematized his degrees of knowledge. Thus, Maritain gave me the grounds for a wholehearted affirmation of Christian intelligence and Christian art, while at the same time knowing when they need to be kept from intruding on each other. Chapter 21. Quick-Eyed Love. Many years ago, the English composer Ray Vaughan Williams introduced me to a poem on love by George Herbert in his musical setting of 5 mystical songs. This song cycle remains among the most powerful marriages of word and music that I know of. And the Herbert poem beginning, "Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back," contains for me just about everything that needs to be said about love. I'm just one of many who have been moved by this poem. one of the three that George Herbert dedicated to the theme of love. The Jewish-born philosopher and mystic Simone Weil said that she felt Christ's presence while reciting Herbert's poem. Christ himself came down and took me, she said. She recited this poem so often that it became to her a prayer. For me, the poem sets out the basic problem of love in dramatic terms, the struggle between the self and others, whether our neighbors or God. The poem begins, "Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. Or guessed, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee." As a teenager, I was drawn to the communion of Southern Baptists by their strong sense of fellowship, their congregational singing, the impassioned personal prayers, and their forthright confession of moral failure and repentance. All this seemed an answer to my sense of being mired in selfishness, which was in various ways reinforced by the common unhappiness of my ordinary middle-class upbringing. I sought a way out of the preoccupation with myself, and the exuberant generosity of the local Baptist church offered that. But there was a drawback. Among my Baptist friends, one kind of unworthiness was addressed, but another was put in its place. Basic unworthiness, guilty of dust and sin, was replaced by a kind of metaphysical unworthiness. Evangelicals view human nature as fallen and the work of grace as extrinsic to an unredeemable human nature. In other words, I was asked to live in a radically divided world, described best in Luther's maxim, at once justified, at once a sinner, simul justus, simul peccator. This distinction leads, I believe, to the evangelical mistrust of human works of all kinds, not just claims to good work, but to works of culture, the arts, philosophy, the humanities. Philosophy was studied among Baptists primarily to find out what it was lacking, how it was in basic discord with Scripture. There was no spirit of cooperation, no instinct to wed the truth of philosophy with revealed truth. Love itself becomes problematic in this universe where all things human are viewed under the species of fallenness. The implications are clearly shown by Lutheran theologian Anders Nygren in his now classic work, Agape and Eros. Nygren's basic point is that in the Catholic tradition, represented by Aquinas, human love, or eros, is considered capable of uniting with grace, or agape, God's love, to produce morally worthy acts. Eros is always acquisitive in its desire to fulfill a need and seek satisfaction. Nygren offers an able critique of this synthesis of agape and eros from a Lutheran position, making sure that human beings get no credit for any cooperation with God's overwhelming grace, God's agape. But Herbert writes, as we continue the poem, "Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. George Herbert's narrator Love herself has no such worries about human nature. Who made the eyes but I? God as creator is a source of goodness in our nature that cannot be destroyed. Yes, this goodness has been marred by sin, but that stain has been removed by the Christ who bore the blame. The Eucharistic image in Herbert's final lines, "Taste my meat," completes the journey from estrangement to communion. This is not the grace that is laid over the penitent's shoulder like a cloak, to use Martin Luther's metaphor, but a grace that penetrates the very body of the believer. So I did sit and eat. Aquinas writes over and over that grace perfects nature, it does not destroy it. Agape does not obliterate eros. God's grace strengthens human love, inwardly ordering it once again to God. Thus my struggle with love only began with the burden of selfishness. The problem of what to do with oneself never comes to an end in this life. But how can self-love be legitimate when the self is made for others and God? That was the question remaining for me. I knew that learning to love did not require leaving the self entirely behind, but I lacked a conceptual grasp of how the self becomes included in the dynamics of agape and God's grace. Some may chuckle at the fact that I was reading about the idea of love, trying to get a handle on love as a concept. But since love is the most difficult thing we are called to do, what is more natural than trying to understand it? Two classic works on love freed me from a long-standing existential puzzle. Why do friends come and go? And why does marriage lose passion? Section in Aristotle's Ethics on the three forms of friendship make a simple distinction between the types of friendship founded on pleasure or usefulness and those based upon a mutual vision of life. It's much more likely that the reasons for two people finding each other useful or pleasurable are going to change than the vision that unites them. Therefore, friends will come and go when these conditions change, if you find your friends no longer useful or pleasurable. Frankly, I was relieved to read this because I long harbored a sense of insecurity about the loss of some friendships. When I took account of my longtime friends, I realized that Aristotle was exactly right. They were the ones who saw the world much the same way I did, and their bond with me never changed. Those who are married commonly joke and sometimes complain about the passing of passion, erotic passion, in their relationship. The intense feelings of courtship, marriage, a honeymoon are eventually replaced by the ordinariness of work, children, and paying the mortgage. Somewhere along the way, perhaps it was because of my romantic temperament, I expected the passion would never subside. I experienced the hard way that passion does subside, and I was foolish not to realize that the love that follows is better. Perhaps I was imbued with what Denis de Rougemont terms the myth of romantic love. In his classic Love in the Western World, de Rougemont traces this myth to the troubadour poets of the 12th century in southern France. These were the traveling poet-singers who entertained at the feudal courts of kings and queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine. The essence of their message was that love's passion thrives on having an obstacle to overcome. For example, a single man loving a married woman, particularly a woman from a higher class, such as Tristan's love for his queen Isolde. The best-known case is that of Romeo and Juliet, two lovers trying to overcome the opposition of quarreling families. Denis de Rougemont offered insight to me into the way I resisted the commonplace demands of love. I also saw the way I tried to create an artificial intensity in my relationships. No doubt this led to unfortunate and destructive behavior on my part, As Herbert said, "Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. I am blessed that I have not gotten what I deserve." Thomas Merton records in his memoir, The Seven-Story Mountain, how his discovery of Chen Gilson's The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy in the stacks of the Columbia University Library helped lead him into the church. It was my reading of Gilson, the same book, that enabled me to conceptualize the relation of the love of the self, eros, to God and to God's love, agape. In short, what you give away comes back to you, but the self you give up comes back in a different aspect. As Gilson puts it, relying on the mystical theology of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, quote, "To say that if a man of necessity loves himself, he cannot love God with disinterested love, is to forget that to love God with disinterested love is man's true way of loving himself." In other words, loving God is rewarded, but without being consciously sought, and this quality of spiritual disinterest is the challenge of the spiritual life. Gilson, pressing further, puts it this way, quote, "To love God is, in a way, to make God love himself in us as he loves himself in himself." It's no historical accident that St. Bernard was writing at the same time that the troubadour poets were entertaining the ladies at court. The final stop in the road of understanding love, not doing it, was, of course, the Mother of God. Mary is the fullest representation of the human intersection of divine and human love. Mary is the mediatrix of all graces. Her very body was used for the redemption of the world. Not surprising that the greatest of all 20th century Protestant theologians, Karl Barth, would argue that Mariology represents the essence of Catholicism, the human cooperation in redemption, and as such must be rejected. Barth is absolutely right that Mary represents the heart of the Church. What the Church is invisibly and should be visibly is present in Mary. She represents the maternity of the Church both literally and figuratively. Mary gave birth to Jesus Christ and represents the necessity of nature receiving grace, leading to the generation of a new life, our own and others. About a year before my conversion, I was jolted by the sudden departure of someone I loved, but whose love I had not treated well. The hurt was compounded by my sense of failure. I spent many months in a daze hoping to win her back, but without any progress. I was to blame, and I knew it. Out of desperation, I went to my local parish, Immaculate Heart of Mary, the one where I would eventually receive my first communion. On the wall to the left of the altar was a portrait of Mary. The picture was nothing great artistically, but the face and the eyes of Mary were arresting in their loveliness. I spent hours over the next few weeks praying before that picture. As I prayed, I realized I was praying to a person who knew all about love and its suffering. My prayers brought me both relief from my loss and a sense of forgiveness for my failure. I saw in her example that love required the complete gift of self. I had been too preoccupied with myself, my work, and making my way in the world to make that gift. My love had restricted itself to providing for my own needs and little more. I, too, was called to cooperate in salvation by growing in love. My conversion a year later did not miraculously cure my problem with self-absorption. I am still converting, no longer from evangelicalism, but from the stubborn self-regard that we all share in our fallen human nature. Conversion never ends, even for those who have always felt at home in the church. I leave it to others, my friends and family, to evaluate my progress. What I know is that I have been given every possible opportunity to enter the body of Christ. As in the poem by George Herbert, love has never abandoned me, never accepted my excuses or let me run away. At each turn I have heard her say, "You must sit down and taste my meat." Between that verse and the next, "So I did sit and eat," there is a mysterious silence, a missing link in the argument of the poem. Why did he sit and eat? Why did I? The silence exists because at the moment of turning toward God, all explanations fail. God fills in the silence. The lure of God's beauty, of his works, of those made by human hands, may stir the heart to seek him, but fails to explain how he is found, or we are found by him. Converts such as I can point to signs and wonders along the way of their journey with gratitude and with hope that others will be similarly moved. But their stories themselves testify to the multitude of ways that God makes himself present to our eyes and ears. What remains universal, however, is that God came down, that he comes down every day and beckons us in him to rest.